All right. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking with Nandi Kayyy,
Hello, happy to
the
be
myth,
here.
the unicorn, the legend, the fabulous. Will you give your own intro of how you see yourself and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Nandi Kayyy. I'm currently based in Jacksonville, Florida, but kind of also a Brooklyn, New York person. I am a queer, agender, anti-racism educator. I'm an artist, and I'm also a techie. I work in product management and have luckily found an intersection of tech and like I'd say DEI to work at. So yeah, I'm just like an artist, always in search of freedom and liberation.
Musician? Didn't your album come
Musician,
out?
yeah, I'm a musician. Yeah, I'm a definitely like I like to characterize myself as like a creative, like a general
Yeah.
artist. I like to work in any medium that seems right, whether that's like a social media post, whether that's a song, whether that is a outfit, Yeah, I like to create things.
You're multi-passionate.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Multi-passionate.
As I say,
Yes.
when people say, "What do you do for a living?" I'm like, because
A
my head gets
multi.
flooded with all of the
I love that.
passionate
Yeah.
creative. Um, okay, so you were one of the incredible leaders at our Legacy trip in December, which now was a month ago,
Yeah.
and a little over a month ago. And I'm doing these conversations with participants and leaders and everyone involved to kind of unpack why, tell us a little bit about how you became a leader for Legacy. And then
Yeah.
we'll go kind of section by section into how it was for you and then after, post.
Yeah. So I met Tina at the beginning of the quarantine. So in 2020, we all ended up in a group together. We all kind of were like, I guess, connected by a good friend of mine, Andre Henry. Some people might know him. Um, I've known Andre for almost 10 years. We met in New York, and one day, Andre posted on Facebook, it was like, we need to have like a Black State of the Union chat about some things that are going on. And myself, Andre Henry, Corey Leak, who was also a facilitator on the trip, Tina as well, Allie Henney, Alicia Crosby, all of us got on a call and just like had a talk about Black stuff. And it was like really, really dope. And ended up being in a group chat. It's called the Black Chat. And that's how I met Tina. So we always talk about all things kind of anti-racism. The first time I worked with Tina, it was with oh my goodness, what's the podcast called?
Speaking
Permission
of
to be.
racism.
Speaking of racism, I'm thinking of another podcast. Okay. Speaking of racism, I think Jen's new podcast is Permission to Be. I think that's what it is. But speaking of racism, was doing these Patreon offerings where they did like once a month, got together, and Tina had an emergency come up once around the time Ahmaud Arbery was killed. And I led that in Tina's stead, and we became friends over the years. We're going, I guess, into the third year of our friendship. And through everything she was doing with Legacy Trips, it just seemed pretty natural that some of us from this group would end up leading it. And so when she pitched it and was like, hey, would you want to lead one of these trips? I was like, absolutely. When she said it was with Corey, I was like, definitely, absolutely. Corey is like the sibling that we were like somehow separated from at some point. So it was really cool to have that opportunity. And I would never miss an opportunity to kind of like immerse myself in, especially Southern, like Black history. I'm born and raised in the South, born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida. And I grew up with like a lot of Black history. I think the South, at least in my opinion, compared to like living in the North, that's something that we're really big on, preserving Black history. And like, we know about Black history down here. I feel in a different way than people in other places do. So I was like, yeah, seems like a really incredible thing to do. And I also was intrigued by the people who would be joining this kind of trip, people like you, people like Angela, Kim. It was a Nikki. Yeah. And people just like, I got to meet people, you know, that I've also interacted with over the years. So that's kind of how I ended up on the trip, by way of friendship, and just, we're all kind of like doing this work in different ways. And it was a great opportunity for us to be together and do it.
Before we go into the trip details, did you have any fears or doubts before going about like, wait a minute, I don't know that I want to be with all these white folks? Or
I don't know if I had like fears. I think one of the main things about, especially because I knew we were like going to be visiting like the lynching memorial and the lynching museum, there is like a certain protectiveness that I feel over like Black grief. And but I just assumed that the people who were not Black, who were going to be in this space, would be reverent of that. Like I didn't feel like I was going to be like in a space where I felt unsafe to like have my own experience outside of the experience that we were facilitating. So I was going in bracing myself for a heavy, like emotional experience, but I didn't have a lot of concerns about like the people. I think I was just like, how would this affect me? And it was my birthday weekend. And I think that when I'm like thinking about my life and then having like this kind of encounter with like ancestors and elders who like we share a history, I felt like it made it more profound. And I was kind of really bracing myself for that more than anything.
yeah, those cupcakes that you
Those
got.
cupcakes were fire. Those were the strawberry cupcake.
Oh my.
I love strawberry cakes. Like, I wonder if that's like a Southern thing or a Caribbean thing, because I feel like I don't see strawberry cakes that much, but I was like, this is fire. Corey wanted it. I was like, Corey, it's my birthday.
Yeah,
You
right. No.
not have it.
And in death, you know, I don't know if you know this, but it's so interesting. There's a death cafe movement that's global, where we get online or we have local gatherings called death cafes for death positive conversations to just normalize death and grief. And one of the main parts of it is eat cake. So I just am wondering that like having cake and sweetness along with the grief and the sorrow of witnessing is really, it's a ritual. And in Judaism, when you're about to study something new with a new group, you're supposed to have a teaspoon of honey to honor the sweetness of learning in community. So to me, like having cupcakes and cake and celebrating your birth within this greater context is just another layer of meaning and connection.
Yeah, I love that. I also thought about that because it made me just think about everyone who came before me so that I could be here and like live the life that I get to live. You know, if I was born, you know, just like a few decades earlier, I could have been one of the names on those, you know, those posts. And I was just like thinking about that and like, wow, you know, yeah.
So moving into the weekend, what are some of the elements that you want to share, the potent or poignant moment, or what do you want people to know about?
So I think first, the trip to Selma was really, really impactful for me. When we were driving there, I was riding with Tina and Jen and Corey. At first, I was just thinking they walked this.
Yeah.
And it was about an hour drive. It was about 50 minutes. And I was thinking they walked this. They were wearing full suits. They were dressed like in their Sunday best. And then when we got to the bridge, I don't know how to like explain the feeling it is to like come in contact with like a structure that carries so much history, like this tangible thing that I can touch that is like directly tied to like how I am able to move about in my life today. Because going on that bridge, it's like you see pictures of it. I've seen that. I've seen videos of the Selma March. I've seen photographs. I've seen, reimaginings where they, they're on the bridge. But being there, yeah, I felt fear. I felt like kind of like determination, like a sinking, digging in of like my heels. I imagined what it was like for everyone who did that march to be coming across that bridge and see that they're like literally faced with violence. It's not like this kind of like proverbial violence that I think people really like to talk about these days. Like I feel like these days violence is like a concept to a lot of people, and it's like a concept. It's not something that's actually real. It's like something you can conceptualize. But on that bridge, like thinking about what it would be like to come across that bridge facing cops on horses with guns who are ready to kill you.
Yeah.
For trying to vote, for existing, and that was, it's like I felt profound sadness, loss, grief, but also like gratitude. And I just, I think about that if I lived at that time, that I would be dead. That's what I think about. Like sometimes I think about the person who I am, and I'm so grateful that I was born like today, because I would not have had, I probably wouldn't have made it to 30 if I was born in the 60s and the 50s, and I just feel grateful for all the people who were like willing to like stand up when it literally meant like, you will definitely lose your life. You will definitely be injured, sometimes beyond repair. You will lose your family members. You will lose your job. You will lose your livelihood. You will lose your house. Like just every single consequence that we think about now, but it was so much more threatening then. And I just was like, I felt in awe of everything that they did. And like I think standing at that bridge was a real like gut check. Yeah. Because some of those people we just lost, like some of them we just lost, like John Lewis, we just lost him, just lost him. And that is also hard to think about. Like I just looked up Claudette Colvin yesterday. She's still alive. She's 82 years old. She is younger than my grandmother would have been, who passed away.
Yeah, I think this point, I think a lot of people, in order to move in their daily life currently, like pretend this is ancient history. And we have a similar narrative with the Holocaust. There's a similar like, oh, that was so long ago. And I think it's really important to keep threading like ages and birthdays and really grounding it like it's not that long ago, and this is part of our current history.
Absolutely. As a kid, I was obsessed with the Holocaust as like, how could something like that happen? As a kid, I was obsessed. Like I read everything I could get my hands on about the Holocaust, because I just didn't understand like how something like that could happen. How also like when I would see the pictures, I'm like, what's the difference between these people? Like, like what, how can they like make these determinations just like looking at these people? Like these are like European Jews. Like I'm like, how how are we making like these arbitrary distinctions and deciding like someone's existence is a threat, is irrelevant, is bad, like needs to be eradicated. Like and that it was just less than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Like we're talking like the Holocaust was what, the 40s, 20s, 40s,
30s and 40s.
30s and 40s, right? That's that's like 70, 80 years. Like we're about to hit 100 years in the next decade-ish, 2 decades. Like that's, people are still alive.
I kind of always had it like way over there. And then when I lived in Israel, I learned so much more about the kind of recent history because it's such a part of Israel.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember calling my grandmother and I was so mad at her. I'm like, what did you do? Why didn't you do anything?
Wow. Yeah.
What was wrong? You know, I just had all of this. And it was before that, I had never associated our family with the Holocaust. But I think that it's interesting that I think in many ways as a kid, studying Black history and being really involved in Black US history as a Jew was less painful than the Holocaust. So it's really interesting to me that you said, oh, I was studying the Holocaust.
Yeah.
It's always been this interesting, there's a lot of intersections and parallels. And the race thing is exactly right. Like Jews can pass as white, and how race keeps changing depending on who's labeling it. But for Black Americans, that's not true and has never been true. So there's similarities and a lot of differences.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know? I always, I think that's very interesting too, like kind of like the flip of that. Like, it's like, it feels like it's far off from you, I think, when it's like so up close. That's really interesting. Yeah. Well,
and the threat response that it can bring up, the fear, you know, the stuff that happened January 6th last year here at the Capitol just brought up a lot of primary fear and nightmares and things in the blood. And so, you know, things in my bones that were coming to life in more of a dreaming state because of that really deep fear. So over the rest of the weekend, how was your emotional state? Like how was did you go into threat response at all? Or did you feel really safe and held by the group? Or talk a little bit more about the weekend?
Yeah, I think I felt super safe and held. It was I wasn't expecting Tina to be there. So that really, I was feeling pretty down on my way there. And I had like a whole flight delay thing and I was feeling so down. But in the morning, like Tina like came to my room and that made me feel so much better. I think I felt really safe in the group of people because I just felt like even my whole thing about like this work is like I don't think that like white people need to understand what I'm going through. I think that is asking a little bit too much. I think like you can't really put yourself in my experience, and especially because of the way that race and racism operates, a lot of the things that happen are it's insidious. It's tiny little things that are happening all the time. It's like I turn on my TV, I scroll on an app, I read a post, it's always there. And I think that the most important thing is like just people like listening to experiences, not necessarily trying to understand, but just being like, when someone says something, this is my experience, like just listening and taking it as that. And I thought that was really honored. I also felt that I was really able to kind of like sit in like my grief, like while going through the memorial and going through like the museum. I also appreciated that, you know, like legacy trips, even though it could be like an intro for people, like the group that came, it's not a one-on-one, not a 101 racism 101 class. It's for people who are like in the journey, constantly making choices every day, like waking up every day and saying like, I want to be different than the world around me says that is acceptable for me to be, especially for white people, because I think it's a harder directive. And I especially say for people who are liberal whites, because I think liberals they think they have a shorter journey, but I think it takes them so much longer to get there because they think they're so close. And so I appreciated that everyone seemed to understand and respect like the space that people who were Black on the trip needed, also while also thinking about like what are things that I can do going back into my life, what are spaces I could create. Like when you were talking about the spaces you're facilitating in your classes and how overwhelming that can be to know that there's not a lot of educators out there doing that, but being able to shine light on the importance and that you are doing that, and even just like thinking about moving from a deficit mindset to like a more grateful, abundant mindset of like, look at all the things we do have instead of looking at the lack. I thought that those moments were really, really important. And being able to like connect with y'all and see, like just meet some new people on the journey and have people to check in with and see what y'all are doing, like how y'all are shaking up your communities. Like that is, it's important because we can only control like our little corners of the world. And I think trips like the Legacy trip, I just think everyone should do it. I mean, everyone should do it. It was some of the things in the museum are like stories that you've heard all the time, especially I grew up in the South. So like, I know like all the stories about the slave trade, but seeing like a map of the transatlantic slave trade and actually seeing like, oh, actually the South wasn't first, you know, like the South wasn't the first people to have slaves in the US, in what we now know as the US. Stuff like little stuff like that, then the greater narrative that the US has shaped, seeing like the actual truth of those narratives, I think can really just like, it's just like reading fucking a people's history of the United States. When I never finished that book because I was so mad. Like I was livid about how just the reshaping of how history is told. That's how I felt in that museum of like, when history is told from the side of the people who won, in quotes, you get a very different story. And I think that the Lynching Museum like allows you to kind of get into the facts from the people who actually experienced it. And I really think that I needed that. We need more things like that in other places as well. The South isn't the only place. Like when I think about the Great Migration, I think about if we follow those tracks, what does it look like to have memorials like that in other towns? What would it look like to have a memorial like that in Central Park? What would it look like to have a memorial like that in Union Square Park, where these people's bodies were buried, that we walk on top of every day, you know? And I just think that we need more of this.
I think the map, the visual, the way that the museum is laid out, one of the things I've been saying since I've gotten back is like, everybody needs to go, because once you see the visual mapping of the story of what happened, there's nothing to discuss or argue. It's clear. It's a clear map from here to here, from what our history is and where we are now. And so that feels like a really important thread that just nothing to argue about, which is why I agree that everybody should go. Who are interested in learning more, or when people say, well, mass incarceration, and I'm like, no, like here's the plan, here's how it was, here's what happened. Now we can start to have honest conversation. Whose voice is missing? Why was it missing? How do we open, like Nikki's podcast, broadening the narrative? How do we open? How do we start to, and then we can come down into these micro conversations and relationships of listening.
Yeah, because I think that, especially when we talk about narrative, I think that the person who tells the best story wins, right? And that's what we see. We see the US has told, quote unquote, the best story, the easiest story that benefits them the most. And even though I know a lot, I don't think that you can necessarily educate yourself out of racism, because we know that many educated people are super racist. However, I do think because the US, we know like literacy in the US is a big problem. Like, I think if you look at some of the stats on the US, when you talk about education, literacy, poverty, like we look like what we would call a third world country as well. And I think that some pieces of those education, I know, especially in the South, places where especially where the Daughters of the Confederacy had their hands on school books and history books, these kind of museums and this kind of educating, this kind of literally connecting the dots for people is really necessary. And that's why I think these kind of places need to be more accessible in more places, because one, it will shake the narrative up. Like if they put a lynching museum in New York City, honey, it would shake shit up in New York City, because New York City thinks that there's no way that there's racism in New York. And I'm like, it connects the dots for you. Like you said, there's nothing to argue about. And then it also shines a light when you think about these people in power who are educated. So then you know that they know, and that they're acting anyway, the way that they act. And I think that's something that people really need, because the US propaganda machine, it worked hard.
The deficit piece that you mentioned before was such a big, like my journal from that day is like all exclamation points.
I love it.
Like fireworks. Because of that operating from the deficit model in other areas, and then that just transferring. And so that was such a important positive intervention for just kind of my internal narrative and mindset about that. And I really brought that to class. So I really, 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 really appreciate it. I told you that, and I can't say it enough. It's just, it really was such a big deal. And I think it's one of the things I look at about Black joy and Black liberation from the sidelines with a bit of like definitely curiosity and envy, because it doesn't quite feel like as a Jewish people we're there yet. And so that was a really interesting aha moment, was like, oh, there's still a lot of fear and deficit. We haven't quite made this bridge to Jewish joy. And it's funny that I say that. Once I came back, I started looking for it more. And one of my siblings in Kohenet, my training program, is a Black Jew, and her podcast and her work is called Joyful Justice.
Love it.
And so then I saw, oh, that's what Aviva Rekefet's doing. That's what April's doing. Okay, cool. So starting to then orient towards joy for more communities, more abundance mindset, more what has happened, and not focusing on the deficit. So I just want to let you know how that has continued to integrate in terms of more alignment and more seeking out, moving away from that model, because it's not that.
I think also that's just something that's generally, it's very hard, I think, to not look at all the deficit, like it is super hard when like the things that you don't have are constantly like blaring you in the face, or the people that do have the things you don't have are constantly saying how if you just worked harder, it's your fault you don't have it. It's, that kind of stuff. It's hard to not focus on that. I think I really struggle with like, it's so like it sometimes I was watching like a documentary about DMX this weekend, and it was really hard. I didn't even watch the whole thing. I basically immediately started crying because I was thinking, watching him struggle, they're videoing it, making a documentary about him, about his struggling. He's in the public eye. He's been like made money for record labels and for all these people. And also, like, we watch him struggle in the public eye, never get help. Or he did get help on multiple occasions, but you know, addiction is a disease. And like, but I think the way we treat people with addiction, like I think of like this current opioid crisis, and then I compare it to like, how do we treat people like DMX?
Right.
And it breaks my heart.
Yep.
It breaks my heart that like he didn't have, with everything that he looked like he had, right, he didn't have that thing. And it is hard it's hard to find like joy. But also I think about all the things, because one thing that kind of got me more towards joy is like white people associating like Blackness with only things that are negative. So like when white people are like, well, I grew up poor too, I'm like, bitch, all Black people aren't poor now. Hold on now. Like, it's like, yeah, I did grow up poor, but like, that's a reality of the US. It's not, that has nothing to do with like your race. You're poor for different reasons that I am poor, right? Like, and I didn't like that people were trying to relate to my experience as a Black person on negative aspects, because I love being Black. Like, I would never want to be anything else. I love Black people. I love like all the things that we have that is like unique to us. Like I was like, you know what? I should probably like stop talking about Blackness as like it's this burden, because white supremacy is the burden, not Blackness. And it took me a long time to get there, to be like, actually, it's not hard being Black. White supremacy is hard.
So that's one of the other conversations we had on one of the nights where we had a conversation that you were leading about whiteness harming everybody. And and then you said something around like, how difficult it might be. Like, I think what you were saying is how difficult it might be to not have community and joy and connection, and how isolated and really that community piece. And I remember we went to see In the Heights, my daughter and I. And when we left, I'm like, oh, there's so much there that we don't have. Like, I don't have, I'll speak for myself.
White supremacy is isolating as fuck. It's individualist.
How much food, community, culture, music, it's just isolated and separated. And there's a part of my particular soul that just longs for that and loves that and has always been really drawn and attracted to that. And so now that it's so clearly named in multiple society, in films and in music, and then sitting in circle and having that recognition, like, yes, like I'm just affirming absolutely the isolation and the whitewashing, literally how much it has harmed and taken from all humans. I'm not saying
absolutely. Again, no, it has
suffering. It's just
and I actually love to, I just want white people to just like stop and look and be like, are you benefiting from white supremacy? Like, I just want every white person to just stop and say, what have I gotten because I'm white? Because I don't think that people are really, only the top of the top, who we all know their names, are really racking up any benefits. Like, white people who become white, because white doesn't really exist. I think about like people who actually do like Italian culture. That's a culture.
Yeah. Right.
Right? Like Italian culture is a culture.
Yeah.
Why would you let whiteness replace that? Like why would you let whiteness, which is basically a culture of hate and violence, is to be hateful and violent towards other people? That's the culture of white supremacy. Why would you give up your rich Italian ancestry, heritage, and culture for whiteness? Like Southern culture, it's rich. Like Southern culture is rich. Why would you give that up for whiteness? Like growing up anywhere in the world, that every place has its own unique culture. Why would you give that up to be white, you know? And I understand for some people it's just easier. I've talked to people who are from the Middle East, who have come to the US, who basically are white now that they're here. And that's an experience that's also unique, of like immigrating to a country, having your culture, and then all of a sudden now you're white when you check a box on something. That's another experience that I feel like, and that's why I'd be like, why don't you just think about how does it affect you negatively?
Right.
Like, how does white supremacy affect you negatively? When I see a poor cishet white man, I'm like, you should be the maddest.
Right.
This system was supposed to be set up for you to win. So why are you not mad tearing it down when you're poor?
Right. I think also I'm hoping that I'm starting to see this kind of snowball, that it's sending some of us who have that longing back to our roots to bring through that. So my kids are growing up with more Jewish stories and narrative and music and tradition than I did. And that's on purpose. And I also have an Irish side. And so I've been exploring like my Celtic roots and like what happened. And that's a very long, resilient story as well.
Yes, it is. Exactly.
And so I think it's sending us back down the lines. Like what else is there? What other traditions are there? And I'm learning that through the beautiful modeling of people like you and the expression of that. And so I really am grateful. For the last part, what about post? How are you doing since you got back? Has it been just integrating well? And any final thoughts on that?
I think that after going to that, so going back into like my job, we're in a DEI space, but we help like pretty privileged people. One thing that I was thinking about, and I have a meeting with someone this week, is that my company is led by a white woman, and she grew up as the Quakers, you know, the Quakers, what are they called? What do they call this school, whatever, which is super cool. Friends. Friends. I thought that was super cool. Never knew about that, but I do know that Quakers, and who is it also? Not Calvinist, they're
Universalist.
I'm thinking of another group of Christians that have like an anti-racist background, but I know the Quakers have like a historically anti-racist background, like, and it was really cool to learn that she grew up like that. But also she was like, you know, my first husband was Black, and, you know, blah, 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 racism, pulled over in the car. And I'm just like, y'all don't use, you know, Black people to shield you from that experience. And so something I was thinking just moving forward is like, how can I kind of like just continue to intersect my two worlds? Like it's very hard to be like openly an anti-racism advocate in tech. Tech is racist as fuck. I've had people say to me like, oh, I don't know if you want to be a product manager or activist. Bitch, I want to be both. Because like technology is also racist because it's built by racism. So for me, I just have been taking remembering to just think of all the people that came before me and know that I'm also one in a line. There will be many people after me. And so like, I don't have to change the world. I only have to try to change my world.
Mhm.
And that's something that I'm always trying to focus on, of how I can make my world more safe for everyone.
Mhm.
And then also how I can just try to shift people's thinking a little bit. I think that asking residents of the United States to care about other people I think that's asking a little bit too much of them, because of the way that we're conditioned in this society to only care about ourselves and not worry about how it hurts. But think about yourself. Like, if you think about yourself, what do you gain? What are you gaining? Like, what's the cost? Do a cost benefit analysis of holding bias against people who are not white, against people who are not straight, against people who are not thin, against people who are not monogamous, against people who are not married, against children. Like, I mean, like, because even we have a children problem, where in the US, apparently children are not people.
Yeah.
And we don't treat them as such. They don't have rights. We do it. They do what we tell them. If they don't, there's consequences. We take away their resources. We, leave them to fend for themselves. And we say, oh, well, it's a hard world out there, so I'm trying to prepare you. Like, think about, what is the cost benefit analysis? Like, do a cost benefit analysis. What are you gaining from participating in this system? Highly likely it's going to be nothing. And like, every day I'm like, what can I gain today?
Yeah.
And like, nothing is gained by me participating in white supremacy. But if I can present abolition to someone in a way that is helpful. Like, I'm running a book club right now with the Done for DD White Labor Collective, and we're reading We Do This Till We Free Us by Mariame Kaba, and it's abolition 101. And the way that it talks through abolition, I think, is so important, so that people understand that, like, we're reimagining a world. We're not talking about, like, how can we, like, take the world we have and make something new. We can't make nothing new out of this.
Right.
We have to think about, what are the things we have not tried yet. We haven't tried to address people's needs. We haven't tried to address people's resource needs.
Yeah.
We haven't tried to make people stop working to be alive. Like,
Prioritize humanity, and mental health and financial health.
Exactly. All those things are all factors into, the things that white supremacy claims that they're protecting white people from.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking, like, how can I put all those things into my little corner of the world? Who can I talk to? Who can I help? Who can I just educate? And I'll be learning too. Like, right now, I'm like super deep into, like, I just started this big K-drama thing. I'm very big into Korean dramas right now. And I'm learning a ton about Korean history, about Korea's Japanese occupation, China, being a part of a Chinese tributary system. Like, I'm learning so much just about, like, colonization and, like, these kind of, like, supremacist ideas. They're global. It's not just in the United States. And we have to also, and that's like one thing about Angela Davis I love, about how she always is like, y'all, think about the world, think about the entire world. And like, whenever I pop in and start learning stuff about a new culture, I'm like, damn, they feel it too. I remember the first time my really good Korean homegirl had gone to Japan, and she talked about what conflicting feelings she had being in Japan. And I was like, wow.
So rich.
So much.
The systems of oppression, like, I love that you're entering it with that sociological view, because I do think it helps actually our nervous systems be able to regulate in the present of our current systems of oppression, and like this late stage capitalist that everybody's in, and this, like, the larger narratives of that. So your curiosity and your love of learning and passion for living is so contagious and so magical. You are truly a divine, divine human.
Thank
I
you.
absolutely love getting to know your work and supporting, walking with you in this life thing.
Yeah.
And asking questions and really listening to your deeply, deeply intelligent responses. So thank you so much for the gift that
Thank
you
you.
are. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad we met. You know, I love
Thank
just
you.
like, I love just making like these serendipitous connections that are just like so beautiful. I just think that there's just so much benefit in learning from people who are different than you. So
Thank you.
thank you.